Hey, and welcome to the Growing Leaders Podcast. This podcast exists because the topic of growing next generation leaders is a spicy one.
You better believe it.
So Jamie, everyone listening, this episode's a little bit different. We don't have a guest speaker. You just have Jamie and I.
Oh my.
Surprise.
That's right.
But we're going to unpack the conference a little bit. We just had our annual global conference. It was our first year being in person post-COVID. And we had leaders from several of our teams and countries around the world, all of our regional leaders here with us in person, with several community leaders from across Metro Atlanta, and also some leaders from Michigan. It was really wonderful to be together. And so here we're going to kind of go through each day and kind of what happened. You can watch all of it on YouTube. But more importantly, you can mark your calendars for next year.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So this is the Love Your City conference.
Yes.
And Love Your City is an approach to mobilizing young leaders to go out into an economically disadvantaged neighborhood, but then to mobilize the business community and churches and everyone to kind of come together to participate together in seeing an entire neighborhood transformed by the power of God and by meaningful impact in a way that then can just keep scaling. So this conference is both for the teams in 9 sites across the world, including Nigeria and Kenya and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and in Boston and San Antonio and Atlanta. So it's for groups, those groups that are exactly implementing Love Your City in ways where we have actually seen entire, what they would call slums internationally, rise out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And we've seen things happen that there are movies made about. But then this is also just about the basic principles of that kind of an approach of, rather than sitting in churches and waiting for people to come to us, of turning outward to love our neighbors, of rather than just as a business focusing only on the bottom line, of turning out to actually build deeper than your bottom line by becoming a beloved key part of your community, and of young people, rather than watching one Netflix movie after another, of actually turning out and becoming the kind of person that they make Netflix about. So it's a really cool gathering of anybody and everyone who is from any of those groups that are saying, I want to grow, I want to learn, I want to be around other people that I can learn from. So that's the basic tenet of the conference. Is there anything else you would say before we go into talking about what happened this year, which was probably the best year ever?
It was. No, I think that is the highlight of it. I think it's a group of people that are coming together to share testimonies of the power of God and to turn and see more testimonies of the power of God happen. And so for a lot of us involved with Boy the Ball, that's through Love Your City. So we had church leaders who are looking at Love Your City possibly being something that they do as their church. But as a business or as a leader, there's lots of ways you can engage with Love Your City. And so it's really just a group of people coming together to see what the Lord will do with all of us together.
Yeah, and so this year, the exact theme of it was something that would apply to any of us, even if you have nothing to do with Love Your City and are just kind of soaking in the electricity of wanting to be involved beyond your walls and borders. So we talked about 3 big themes that we really pointed to the way Jesus shared the gospel of the kingdom. And we focused on the idea of making it
real.
Making it real is exactly right. So Jesus shared the gospel of the kingdom by making it real through 3 key points. Mm-hmm. And we basically took 1 point, which was incarnation for the first day, a 2nd point, demonstration for the 2nd day, and proclamation for the 3rd day. So incarnation, what would be, okay, you went through the conference to see how you did. What would be your quick hit of what incarnation is?
Well, and I will give you a highlight of, I was just on the phone this morning with our team in Nigeria who was watching virtual. Yeah. And one of the girls was like, it all made sense for the first time ever. And I was like, what made sense? And she was like, incarnation, it's God through us instead of us alone. And I was like, that's exactly what it is. It's his presence being demonstrated through us, his presence coming through us versus us stepping into something in our own strength.
That's exactly right. And Jesus is the perfect example of that, where the life of God, the love of God is incarnated, and he pitches his tent right in your neighborhood, and he walks in looking for you, where you can watch him walk up to you and see him even before he opens his mouth. You're seeing the love of God and the life of God and his expressions, and the fact that he's looking at you, the fact that he's coming towards you. And of course, Jesus did that, but we all can do that as well. So there was a guy named Esteban Ortiz, who's a leader from down in Costa Rica, who's an incredible speaker. And he shared, and he had our good friend Anna Curry translating for him. And that was pretty great. Esteban's a very effective communicator, but he was also sharing about something that, I think his team down there is really living.
Yeah. So Esteban did present in Spanish, and Anna translated for him simultaneously, which was really great. And all of the feedback from the leaders who were watching virtually, even though it wasn't in their language, were so deeply impacted. Like none of it was lost in translation. And I think it was a great way to start the conference.
La encarnación es cuando Jamie me compartió el tema y empecé a leer y a intentar entender un poco más de eso.
When Jamie shared the theme with me of incarnation and I began to read and study a little bit about it,
es uno de los conceptos más profundos y más grandes que existen.
There are some of the most deep and profound concepts that exist.
El creador del cielo y la tierra, el que nos hizo a nosotros, a usted y a mí, de repente viviendo en medio de nosotros, infiltrado en medio de nosotros.
So the creator of the whole world who made you and I, he came in the middle of us and lived among us.
Bajo el mismo pacto que nosotros también con Dios y bajo la misma autoridad del Padre.
Under the same covenant with God and under the same authority with God.
Y desde el inicio fue la voluntad de Dios que nosotros continuáramos esa misión de estar infiltrados en medio de la gente, anunciando que hay un nuevo reino.
So from the beginning, it was the plan of God that we, in the same way, would continue infiltrating among people and living out this same mission.
Y tal vez lo que es importante y muy importante que nosotros entendamos es que para Jesús encarnar, convertirse y estar en un cuerpo sujeto a las mismas cosas que nosotros, no era...
One of the most important things for us to understand is that for Jesus to come in flesh, in a body, just like us.
No era su trabajo de 8 a 5. No era algo que él hacía.
It wasn't what he did.
Era lo que él era.
It's who he was.
24/7, 365 días del año.
24/7, 365 days a year.
Y para nosotros tiene que ser igual. No es algo que hacemos, es el fundamento de lo que nosotros somos, es nuestra identidad como hijos de Dios.
It's the same for us. It's not what we do, it's the foundation of who we are as sons and daughters of God.
Y el problema a veces en la iglesia, muy particularmente en la iglesia, es que nosotros vemos la encarnación como algo que hacemos.
So many times the problem with a lot of churches and us in churches is that we see incarnation as something we go do.
Casi como una jacket, como un chaleco que podemos ponernos cuando nos sentimos con ganas de encarnar a Jesús.
Almost something like we go and put on a jacket when we feel like incarnating Jesus.
Es como si nosotros de repente vamos y hoy siento que voy a encarnar a Jesús, así que voy a ir un tiempo y te digo, good incarnation today. Yeah, that's like
it's almost like we put on the jacket and we're like, I feel like incarnating Jesus today. Good incarnation today.
Y luego nos quitamos el chaleco o la jacket y en la casa ya no somos luz, somos oscuridad, o en otro lugar donde estamos caminando ya, ahí no voy a encarnar, aquí.
And then we get to our house and we take off the jacket, and instead of being light, we're darkness, and we're like, well, that was for out there, but not necessarily here.
Y tenemos que entender que no es algo que hacemos.
So we have to understand it's not something that we do.
Es lo que somos.
It's who we are.
It was probably our first time of having a main speaker in another language. That'll happen more and more.
It's just the beginning.
As there's a Chinese team or a Cambodian team. But I think for the Latin American teams, they were pretty excited by that. And then we went right from that into Jim Newsom. He was a second part of that same session. And Jim was really sharing about evangelism and some similar content to some of the things he shared on the podcast, the last podcast. Was there anything that struck you from that day as a whole as we were talking about incarnation?
Well, I think with Jim, he went a little deeper than he could have on the podcast here. And so I thought it was great to have him.
Now, in the Gospels, there are 4 things stated that lend itself to the whole idea of sharing the gospel and evangelizing those who are lost. One is found over in Matthew 4:19, where Jesus said to his disciples that I will make you fishers of men. And so one of the things I begin to understand where that concept is concerned is that fishing is very, very important. Most churches' idea of becoming fishers of men is to put a sign on the outside of the building and say, visitors welcome, and hoping that sign will draw people who don't know the Lord into their church, where they will preach a message and a gospel message, and they will get saved. And though that does happen, that's more the exception and not the rule. To be a true fisherman, you got to go where the fish are. It'd be kind of like if I invited Jamie over to my house to go fishing, and when he got there, I was in my lounge chair with my rod out, and I had cast my rod, the hook, into my carpet. And Jamie would say to me, Jim, I thought we were going fishing. I said, we are going to fish right here. He said, there's no fish in here. I said, whoa, I got a sign on my front porch that says fish are welcome. Sooner or later, I'm sure a fish will jump in here and I'll be able to hook them. That's preposterous. What you got to do is you got to go where the fish are. Real fishermen know the best fishing places. And in fishing, what's very, very important is the bait. And it doesn't matter whether I like the bait or not. What matters is whether the fish like it or not. So just like Jesus, who was very unorthodox in his way of reaching people who are lost, you've got to be unorthodox. Now remember, the bait is designed to get the fish to nibble around the hook. So whatever brings them close to the hook is what you want.
I just really appreciated how it was all woven together. And then what happened after that in the afternoon I really loved was the breakout where we talked about like what is Love Your City? What is Love Your City, and like what does it mean for people meeting Jesus? Because people always ask that, like how does this actually work and how does it actually change people's lives? And so that was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, that's the benefit of being at the conference is you're taking these big ideas of incarnation, demonstration, which we'll get to next, and proclamation. And then you're turning and saying, okay, as you go out into a community, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And you had a lot of Q&A, a lot of people sharing different stories. There was some pretty electric stories. I was trying to avoid the word spicy because it's our favorite adjective on this podcast, but it was spicy stories. Anytime you have Josue Garcia from Costa Rica, it gets a little spicy, but really great stories. But I just love the interaction.
Yeah.
Where you're in a community of practice, you're with a group of people that are trying to do something that is not as hard as it is new for them, mm-hmm. new muscles. And you're helping each other. It was a great day.
Well, and you heard stories from Africa, you heard stories from the United States, you heard from Latin America, and they were all very unique to their culture, but all very much the power of God.
One of the amazing things that the Lord has done over the past now 15, 20 years is that one of the communities that we were involved in Costa Rica is now no longer there. And the name of this squatter settlement was El Triángulo. And so Josue was there almost from the beginning of witnessing, being part of what was happening, and then really witnessing the fact that now it no longer exists. So we've asked him to share a couple of things that are like key. What are some key things that helped this happen? And then for people who haven't touched Love Your City, what are things you would tell them?
Bueno, está la parte bonita y la parte triste.
So there's the beautiful part and there's the sad part.
La parte bonita es cuando todos estábamos pensando en que les iban a dar una casa a cada una de estas familias.
So the beautiful part was we were working with the Ministry of Housing and they were promising basically a house to every family.
Un día me llamó la representante del gobierno para reunirme con toda la comunidad.
So one day a representative of the government called him and asked him to gather all of the people from the community.
Entonces me subí en unas gradas y yo les dije a ellos, si Dios viniera en este momento y les preguntara, ¿qué quieren?
So he stood at the top of the stairs and then was asking everyone, if God were to come right here in this moment and were to ask you, what do you want?
Entonces ellos dijeron, queremos una casa.
They all said, we want a house.
Entonces compartí con ellos una historia bíblica y después les dije, bueno, vamos a gritar 3 veces todos juntos, Jesús, queremos una casa.
So he shared with them a Bible story and then said that they were going to shout together 3 times, Jesus, we want a house.
Y todo el pueblo estaba diciendo, Jesús, queremos una casa.
So all of the village together, the squatter settlement, was yelling, Jesus, we want a house.
Porque yo les conté la historia a ellos que cuando el ciego vino a Jesús, Jesús le dijo, ¿qué quieres? Y él estaba ciego. Era obvio que quería.
So he was telling them the story of the blind person, that when he came to Jesus and Jesus said, what do you want? And he was blind. So he obviously wanted to see. He said, I want to see.
Pero él pudo haber dicho, me estás robando protagonismo, no me están dando dinero, diles que me den dinero. Pudo haber dicho el ciego.
He could have easily said, I want money, or I want something else, or you're not giving me this, but he didn't. He said, I want to see.
Y Jesús pudo haber dicho a Judas, dale para 3 meses y que se vaya tranquilo.
And Jesus could have said to Judas, give him provision for 3 months and send him on his way.
Pero Jesús quería oír de sus propios labios, quiero ver.
But Jesus wanted to hear from his own lips, I want to see.
Así es que ellos gritaron, Jesús, queremos una casa.
So they all yelled together, we want a house. Jesus, we want a house.
Vinieron las máquinas, los tractores, quitaron todas las casas y el gobierno dio a las familias su casa.
So tractors came and demolition groups, and they tore the settlement down, and the government gave people a house.
Eso nos dio la oportunidad, como el niño y la bola, para traer la palabra a la comunidad y empujarlos a buscar ayuda en Jesús, no en el niño y la bola.
And so this gave us the opportunity to help people cry out to God and to see him answer their needs, not boy with the ball.
La buena noticia es que muchas de las familias del Triángulo ahora están viviendo en casas en los cuadros.
So one of the neat parts about this is close to the area where they're working right now, a lot of the families got houses in that area. So a lot of the relationships were able to.
Y eso nos ha facilitado para los vecinos de los cuadros llevar el niño y la bola, porque tenemos familias ahí que nos conocen y ellos están abriendo las puertas a nosotros.
So this has really helped even in what we're doing today currently, because a lot of the families have helped other neighbors even know who we are and have opened doors to us that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
So then everybody got a chance to get some rest, but we came back to the next day where you were our moderator, which was great.
I don't know whose idea that was.
So somebody on the planning committee just not thinking straight. And then on top of that, you took advantage of that position to present the speaker as your husband, as Pete.
It's a good dude.
We planned that. You guys were seamless together. It's like you're practicing all the time.
Which we never do. It always freaks him out because he's like, do we need to coordinate it? I'm like, I don't practice.
But
I can't.
Typical of many of the marriages of the couples around us in our lives with Boy the Ball, you guys are pretty much opposites.
In every way.
In every way. So that was great. And Pete did an incredible job of sharing about demonstration. And I'll take a whack at this one. Demonstration is a cool one where Jesus didn't just walk in, embodying what the Father was telling him to do as he walked into your life. But then he demonstrated the power of the kingdom through miraculous acts and signs. If you're blind and you're watching Jesus, you're not watching anything. I'm
You're
so
listening.
sorry. You're listening. Or you're hearing the crowd come and all of a sudden you hear Jesus' voice and he's speaking to you with compassion. He's incarnating it. But then when he turns and he changes your life from being blind to being able to see, you have just touched the power of the kingdom. And so much of what's happening today, of the next generation not being drawn to what's happening in our churches or in our communities. It's just where they're hearing a lot of words and a lot of talk, but they're not getting to touch the power. And I thought Pete did a really good job of illustrating how the power of God's demonstrated across the Bible, and we're made for it and we need it.
So Jesus incarnates the way that we are to follow. Jesus lives under the authority of God the Father, and everything he does demonstrates that authority, the love, the power, the purpose of God in the world to everyone around him. In the same way, we live lives of demonstration, giving evidence to the authority of the kingdom we are living in. People who are under the authority of God the Father, who live in intimacy with him, demonstrate his authority to everyone they come into contact with. As Esteban said, we're not doing philanthropy, we're announcing a new kingdom in our midst. And not just using words, but showing the good news in a way that draws people in. The scene where they cut through the roof and lowered the paralyzed man down was an attraction, I would imagine. I imagine there was some conversation that evening about what had happened. A really good street performer can draw a crowd, but that's just to see someone dance or sing or maybe some magic tricks, and then we all go home. But demonstrations of God's good news, his love, his power, his purpose in the world will attract people and then transform them.
Well, and to use that blind story, the blind man story, there's so much of young people right now that are resistant to things of God or the church because there hasn't been the demonstration of power, partially because there's such a presentation. Everything has to be so nice and so shiny. But the way Jesus healed the blind man was by like spitting into some mud and rubbing it into his eyes. There's nothing glamorous about that. It's kind of gross, but it was miraculous. And like a miracle happened. And so sometimes too, the demonstration is like, doesn't make sense. And it's not what you would ever want to do, but it's the way God demonstrates his power.
Yeah, and let's just be really honest. I don't think anybody cares about anything in churches if it's not all real.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're talking about this God, but it's all talk and you need a smoke machine and you need like a laser light show and you never allow me as a young person to touch the reality of it and the reality of how it can help my broken family or my broken heart or my doubts and fears about my future or my physical ailment. If it never becomes that real, then I'm going to stop listening. So I loved that day, and Pete did a great job. And then from there, what happened after?
Then we heard from Eric and Elizabeth Schenkel.
That's right.
We heard their kind of story and their testimony from having been in Uzbekistan and attacked, which is pretty powerful.
Another strong demonstration where they get attacked with men with axes. I mean, they're
Radical
badly broken.
like terrorists.
And they don't leave.
Mm-hmm.
Like they come back, which was a powerful demonstration of agape love.
Mm-hmm. Which it created, they had struggled with relevance in the community, but as they came back, then the community embraced them and they were like, how could you ever come back to this? And then a lot of things changed for the community and for people in their lives. And so it's pretty amazing. But then from there, there was lunch, and then there was a breakout, which was houses and teams.
And so as soon as I could, when Eric and I had a moment alone in the hospital in Austria, I said to him, I think we're meant to go back. And he said, I know, of course, we're supposed to go back. And that was not an obvious choice at that point. Nobody expected us to go back. Certainly the people in Uzbekistan didn't expect us to go back. My family didn't expect us to go back. But we knew we were meant to go back. And it turns out that in going back, in hearing God's voice and going back, we were able to experience the redemption of God in the midst of suffering, that God takes terrible things. It's not that was a good thing that happened to us. It was a terrible thing that happened to us. But God redeems everything. And he redeemed that. And he turned that into really a priceless gift. Because before that, I had gone out to speak to women's groups. And always, when I would speak, I said good things, but they always took a huge discount off of what I said, that I didn't understand them. I wasn't one of them. I was just this American who didn't know what she was talking about, which maybe, arguably true. But, but after that, I had like more credit than I should have had. They saw me as one of them. We both became members of that community. We were adopted into that community by virtue of having suffered as they had all suffered. They all had stories. They all had stories from the Soviet Union, all of them, every family. And so it was like God gave us the credentials that we needed to be effective in that place in bringing the good news. It was amazing, amazing, amazing. So not only did we have the joy of being with Jesus in that, but we had the joy of this incredibly fruitful time.
That's right. And we were, we're not messing around with this, but we're touching some things that we don't talk about all the time, which is we all talk about churches. And of course, within the body of Christ, local churches is one of the strong structures, and it's the central structure. But there was another structure of the body of Christ early on, which were these apostolic bands. You see it with John the Baptist, you see it with Jesus, you see it with Paul. And we've not emphasized that so much. So the houses are called modalities and the teams are called sodalities. We really focused on how St. Patrick in Ireland, he really did use the two together. He used these apostolic bands that were going out and engaging the community and building education. We've talked about that. We talked about what's an Abbey Church and how do I get one with Dr. Robert Grant and Chris Hyatt. So you can go back and listen to that podcast. But then there was also the Abbey Church that they were building together. And so we had a chance to have a panel that had Roger Hyatt, had you on it, had me on it, and it also had Pastor Chris Hyatt, who was on that Abbey Church episode. And we just kind of talked it out and really gave a lot of room for questions and wrestling through it. That went pretty well as well.
It did. Yeah, it was a great conversation. It's an important conversation. And I think it's one that should be happening more often, because oftentimes the houses, the churches are trying to be like those mobile teams.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when those teams aren't healthy, they're trying to be like churches. And so it's really, there's a gift in both.
That's right.
And they each are made with purpose.
That's right.
And so I think it's really important conversation. There's an analogy, I don't remember who used it one time, but it really helped make things make sense for me. The differences between a church and an apostolic team or a boy the ball team. Churches are like hospitals, where it's a place that puts people back together, whereas an apostolic team is more like the ambulance that goes between where the people are in the trenches and brings them to the hospital. And on the way there, there's some putting back together and some triage, but really the work of an apostolic team isn't to rebuild people the way it is of a local church. And so you need both, which I love being a part of both, because being in a boy the ball team, there are covert ops moments, even as we're talking about yesterday with our team in Nicaragua and everything that's coming out of there. Like, our team has to exist under the cloak. You can't be out the same way, but you get to do some different things and be led by the Holy Spirit in a different way. And then you get to bring people into the church, and then the church has a part to play in putting them back together and restoration and all of that. So I love being a part of both. I think they're both unique and you need both, but they play different roles.
The capstone of that night then was that we all came together with our good friend David Kim. He's a Korean worship leader here in Atlanta, and he had a very young team that led us in worship, which we quickly were experiencing the manifest presence, which that's its own demonstration, but the manifest presence of God. But then we created a space for 3 very dynamic testimonies. It was Molly Johnson, it was Josue Garcia, and then it was Moses Aboka from Kenya, Josue Garcia from Costa Rica. And they each shared riveting testimonies of how God has transformed their lives. And then we had this really cool thing where you could come up with a Sharpie and write what God has done this year for you on a rock, a statement or two. And then we just kind of created this kind of altar while David Kim and the worship band continued. And then we opened up the altar for ministry times. And many people were dealing with physical ailments. A lot of people were dealing with really hard things that they were facing. But then we also had Roger Hyatt, who has a very prophetic ministry, and people were kind of hearing God speak about different things. There was deliverance. What was really cool about it is what we had talked about in the morning was happening. And I think it's a key for reaching young leaders is that that you give room for God to do and back
You don't just
up.
talk about it,
You don't
but you
just talk
create
about it.
space for him to do what he's going to do.
Yeah, it was great. That was my favorite night, to be honest with you.
Yes, I would agree.
Last day, third day was
Proclamation.
okay.
And proclamation, we had Pastor Chris Hyatt kind of come in and he spoke first, and it was really great. And then we shifted from that to then we call them logos, which is really like accomplishment stories, testimonies from across the year from all of our teams. And that was pretty impactful too, pretty amazing, because it's speaking true what the Lord has done. And so specifically coming out of a night like Friday night where so much was done, it's really it's a benchmark for the year of just like, these are all, and the list went on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
It could have gone on for hours. We had to limit it to 45 minutes.
Yeah. And you can see on the YouTube channel also Molly Johnson, who's our communications director. She created these really beautiful videos that kind of they're really like poetic works. One about incarnation, one about demonstration, one about proclamation, that was kind of peppered across those accomplishments and stories. It was wonderful. It was electric.
Well, and I think what's interesting about this day that you'll see as you watch some of the clips and videos is when we're talking about proclamation, we're not talking about sitting on the street corner and yelling, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. It's really, it starts with what the Lord has done. It's the good news. And it's there's a meekness to it. And it's him, it's like in the incarnation, it's his power through us, and then us standing on the things that he's done and telling that good news.
Chapter 4, verse 23, it says, "And Jesus went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people." You know, packed into that one little verse are the 3 points of this year's Love Your City conference: incarnation, demonstration, proclamation. Jesus went throughout all of Galilee. He came close to where they were, came to where we were, and he became flesh and blood and dwelt among us, not waiting for us to draw near to him. He came near to us, and he went throughout all of Galilee, touching people. And then he also healed every disease and affliction among them, demonstrating his power to make things right in our lives. Finally, he taught and proclaimed the gospel of the kingdom everywhere he went. Incarnation, demonstration, proclamation. What's even more convincing is that 5 chapters later, at the end of chapter 9, Matthew says virtually the same thing, almost word for word. Not because he forgot about it the first time, but because it bears repeating, like bookends of Jesus' life and mission. If it's important enough to say twice about Jesus, then I'd say it's important enough to be evident in our lives as his followers. God has called us to incarnate his rule and reign by living under his authority, and to demonstrate his power and his love to everyone we meet, and to proclaim the good news of his kingdom.
The word proclamation really comes from a word that was when they would announce a new king. And I love to think about Camelot, but if you were to find that, Camelot had been, a king who dies and it goes into a time of darkness and you don't have a king, and all of a sudden King Arthur comes to the throne and there's a king, there would be notices, or there would be announcers that would go out and proclaim that there's a new king. And it means, first of all, that something has happened and things have changed. And that's for sure true with Jesus coming. But it also means that there's a new king in town, and everything is different in a constant way. And so proclamation isn't just about going and sharing this message. It's about opening people to say, it's here. It's close. The kingdom of God is nigh. So that was great. There was one there were 2 more pieces, because then we went out that afternoon into Love Your City in Norcross, Georgia, a community we call the Sarah Court community. But we actually participated in a Love Your City community walkthrough with leaders from all over the world who do this in their own communities. How was that for you?
I actually wasn't there.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll tell you how it was.
I couldn't be there for that part.
It was pretty darn cool, because we ran a tutoring center and had so much fun with the kids. But we just, you have highly skilled people alongside people who were brand new. And it was a wonderful day. We had a new business leader from Jackson Healthcare, and he came in and was just watching it all and saying, first of all, I want our company to be more and more involved doing this kind of stuff. But second of all, how cool for my first time to watch people from all over the world doing this kind of stuff. So that was great. And then we wrapped it up that evening.
Yeah, with what we called a night of generosity, which it's a trick, wasn't actually about money.
Yeah.
Which was really good. We also heard some stories from different leaders across Gwinnett and the U.S. But want to tell us a little about that?
That evening was really about looking at the way to bridge the distance between success, which many of us do somehow get to, but to significance, which very few people get to, is through generosity. And so that could be generosity with your time. That could be generosity with your heart. That could be generosity with the gospel, for sure. But it's also generosity with finances. And we had several people who just kept sharing different stories of either how God has showed them that. And there's nothing that is more indicative of the new kingdom than the moving away from the scarcity of the old kingdom, where I have to cling to everything because I'm not going to ever have anything more, to a different world where Jesus is our provision. And God really, you can't outgive God, but it's more so where your life isn't indicated by what you have, but it's indicated by it's dictated by what He has. And so it was a wonderful night. There were good testimonies, and we were able to pray for all of the individual teams as they would head back out into their countries. But then we also prayed for all of the church leaders, and we prayed for all of the marketplace leaders. So if you love this podcast, this Love Your City conference next year, or even as you watch these pieces of it, it's your home. It's the place to come to.
Consider this your invitation, June 1st through 3rd, 2023.
Okay, and that's going to be right here in Atlanta.
It is.
That's
Metro
good.
Atlanta.
Metro Atlanta, biggest airport in the world, easy to get here. And it would be really, really fun to have you.